Rishi Sunak just can't stop giving interviews where he gets demolished. The first one I want to show you is from when the Prime Minister spoke to Good Morning Britain's Susanna Reid. A number of subjects were discussed, including the NHS. Waiting lists are at record highs right now, but they've been going up consistently since the Tories first returned to office in 2010. Now, Rishi Sunak has a novel explanation for why that is.
The other thing you're trying to bring down, waiting lists. Waiting lists now, 7.68 million people waiting to start treatment at the end of July. The highest number since records began. The NHS is broken under your watch, isn't it?
No, I absolutely don't think that's right. I come from an NHS family. My dad was a GP, my mum was a pharmacist.
Almost 7.7 million
I think everyone watching will know that we've had a pandemic, which is why waiting lists are also at a record high.
4.5 million people before the pandemic.
Well, you're talking about under my watch, so let's just talk about it. Waiting lists also at a record high in
Wales.
Wales.
You were part of the government, by the way,
Scotland,
before the pandemic.
So everyone is having a tough time with waiting lists. But look, I can tell you, we are making progress on the longest waiters. We've put record funding into the NHS weeks after I became Prime Minister, billions of pounds. Ambulance waiting times have come down considerably. I remember when I first became Prime Minister, you'll remember, you reported on it a lot. It was taking people an hour and a half to get an ambulance. We brought that right down.
Shocking.
But when it comes to waiting lists...
I was afraid to call an ambulance. But we're not talking about waiting times, we're talking about waiting lists.
So can I address that? Can I address that?
Yes.
Because you're right, you talked about people like Bill. You talked about people struggling with their food bills. So the reason that waiting lists are going up is because we've got industrial action, because doctors are on strike. Now, I've sat down and tried to do the reasonable thing.
That might be one of the reasons.
That is the number one reason. But if I could just finish, it's really important.
That is not the number one reason.
Yes, it is.
There was already a backlog.
No.
Sorry, before the pandemic, it was 4.5 million.
But if you look at what was happening to it, we had stabilised it, it had stopped going up, and it was forecast to start coming down until industrial action started. That's the reality.
We were making such great progress, people. There were forecasts. So apparently the Tories were doing so well on waiting lists before the strikes. But if that's the case, then why on earth were 4.4 million people on NHS waiting lists in June 2019 compared to 2.5 million when they came to power in 2010? Were strikes to blame for that figure almost doubling after 9 years of Tory government? Because I've got news for you, Rishi. There were barely any strikes in that period. Or perhaps the Prime Minister thinks that waiting lists almost doubled for one reason between 2010 and 2019, and have almost doubled again, that number is now 7.6 million, for an entirely different reason between 2019 and 2023. It all gets very complicated. Because again, Rishi, I have news for you. The common variable throughout all of this entire period is the Conservatives being in charge. It's really that simple. Helena, this was a puzzling interaction, wasn't it?
I'm actually going to dissent a little bit on this one. I actually feel not sorry for Rishi Sunak, but I don't think it's his fault. I don't think it's necessarily his fault, right? So since he became Chancellor in 2019, we've seen the largest sustained increase in NHS funding since 2010. Now, I'm not saying this is good or is even good enough, but what I'm going to say is that there is one person and one person only to blame for current NHS waiting lists, and he's to blame for 95% of the problems facing this country, and it's George Osborne, right? All of these things he said about ring-fenced funding for the NHS. As a percentage of GDP, NHS funding continually decreased from 2010 to 2019. The only Chancellor who's actually increased NHS funding is Rishi Sunak. Even if you take away all the money that was just thrown away on dodgy contracts the Conservatives make, so obviously I'm not going to defend here. When you're at the point at which waiting lists were already continually increasing, almost kind of diametrically opposed to the drop in funding over the course of the 2010s. He's basically in a rock and a hard place where he has no solution because he can't just... They are opposed to deficit spending. They are not modern monetary theorists. They are monetarists in the Conservative Party. So he's got, as far as he's concerned, no money left to be able to put into the NHS to be able to decrease these things. And there's been no capital investment in new capacity because of the fact that basically all capital investment in the 2010 austerity period was siphoned away to be able to have these kind of very bare bones public services elsewhere. So his only thing that he can really say is to blame the strikers and the pandemic, because otherwise he would have to blame the chancellors that preceded him. He'd have to blame Philip Hammond, and he'd have to blame George Osborne. And of course, you can't really do that if you're the current Prime Minister. So he doesn't really have anywhere else that he can go on this one.
Also this morning was an interview between Sunak and Sky News' Beth Rigby, with Rigby really turning the knife.
Someone having a good week and enthusing the party members is your predecessor, Liz Truss. I was at her event yesterday, packed room. Are you pleased that she's come to conference? I remember you had the decency not to turn up to hers last year.
Absolutely. We're a broad church, we're a Conservative party, people are together. But look, I'm out and about talking to hundreds of my members, all very supportive of what we're doing on net zero, all very supportive of what we're doing to support towns around the country, all very supportive of our increase to the national living wage to give a £1,000 pay rise to 2 million of the lowest paid people, all very supportive of what we're doing today, by the way, on Jade's Law.
Is it
ensuring that interest is really important because you haven't asked me about it. I mean, these are important announcements that we are making. People remember that horrific crime, and it can't be right if someone murders their partner that they then have rights over their children. Now that just defies common sense. We're changing that. So these are the kind of things that we're getting on with. A lot of support for that.
But we're at Conservative Party conference. Liz Truss is talking about tax cuts. The party still loves her. It seems to be more than they love you. Does that sting?
No, gosh, no. You have a totally different version of what's happening.
Do you not care?
I had this
she's
debate.
There talking about...
I had this debate with everyone last summer. My views on this are really
and
simple.
You lost last summer.
And I'm sitting here as Prime Minister talking to you today. So
with no
that should tell you
from the members.
That should tell you where we are. But look, this is simple. This is simple.
So
people
do you
right
think
now,
people have forgotten what she did to the economy too quickly?
If I could just answer. Right now, the number one challenge people have is the cost of living. That's why the first of my priorities was to halve inflation. That is the best way to help people. The best tax cut that any Conservative can deliver is to bring inflation down. And you know what? That's what Margaret Thatcher thought. That's what Nigel Lawson thought. They were strong Conservatives. I'm following their lead, and that's how we're going to help everyone.
That was really tough to watch. I'm the leader. There was a popularity contest last year, didn't you know? Yes, we do know, Rishi. You lost. So it's difficult to appeal to your popularity. Let's go back to that interview.
You made the point about you're sitting here, Liz Truss is not, but you were not elected by members. The point is, at this conference, you are a man without a mandate. You haven't got a mandate from the country. You haven't got a mandate from your own party. You're now making huge decisions about scrapping part of HS2 without anyone apart from a core of your own MPs giving you this job. If you were really serious about the long term, why don't you just go to the country?
Because that's not what the country wants.
They don't want an election.
I go out and about every day. That is not what anybody wants. What people want is politicians making a difference to their lives. Right? So I made a big decision on net zero. I'm saving all those families you're talking about £5,000, £10,000, £15,000. And if people want to criticise me for that, they should explain to those families why they think they need to pay an extra 5, 10, 15 grand to do things that aren't necessary for us to hit our net zero targets. I think the British people are completely and squarely behind my approach to net zero. They think it's the right long thing for the country.
You're afraid of an election because you'll lose.
I'm just getting on and delivering for people. You can see that with net zero. You can see it with the number of boat crossings down this year by a fifth. You can see it with our progress on bringing inflation down, helping people. You can see it with the long-term workforce plan, hiring doctors and nurses for the future. These are all things that are going to change our country for the better. It's an example of the type of leadership that I'm bringing.
People want all of these things. Well, how do you know? I just know. I just know. In the 2019 general election, we had two parties, Labour and the Tories, between them getting what, about 80% of the vote, committed to net zero, committed to the kinds of things which Sunak is discarding at record pace. This is unprecedented. This is unprecedented for a politician to not only not have a mandate from an election, but not even from his own membership, to behave this decisively, this much at odds with his predecessors, particularly Boris Johnson, who did have a mandate. It completely rides roughshod over any democratic legitimacy our system has. Journalists are basically teasing him for being illegitimate, unpopular, and frankly, not very good.